Good evening and welcome to Planet Action. We are beginning today till the end of the ongoing Summit on Climate Change COP27 in Egypt. We'll give you the most comprehensive coverage of the discussions going on there.
27 UN Climate Change Summit money will feature high on the agenda and is sure to be a sticking point in negotiations as a developing world continue to face a severe climate crisis. My name is Purity Museo.
And I'm Dennis. Assetto. Purity will be engaging a climate expert and they will bring into perspective how developing countries want compensated for the loss and damage they have suffered. But before that now, climate financing is a thorny issue when it comes to addressing issues surrounding climate change. It's widely agreed that developed nations responsible for huge emissions take the major responsibility by playing their role in not only limiting the amount they emit, but by committing themselves financially. But have they really lived to their promises? That's the big question of the day. But now let's just have a conversation on what exactly we mean when it comes to matters planet action. The agreements that were made way back to Paris Agreement then come forward to COP26 in Glasgow. And some of the issues that were raised during COP26, that is rather Paris Agreement, it was adopted on December 12, 2015. This after global leaders sat down and saw the catastrophe that the world continues to experience due to climate change. Hence, the adoption of Paris Agreement on December 2015. Now, they agreed to mobilize $100 billion from 2020 to 2025. This is to help the world just become more green, developing countries to get better, be able to fight the catastrophes that they continue to experience. Now, to support low carbon growth in developing countries, we know that developing countries emit less into the atmosphere. Therefore, they need help in ensuring that they just don't use coal, things that dirtify the environment and make our stay here a little bit harder. Now, achievement of Paris Agreement is political resilience. After Trump walked out of Paris Agreement, it was thought that countries like Brazil would follow suit, but they managed to convince them on the importance of clean energy, a greener environment, the importance of Paris Agreement. Now, normalizing 1.5 degrees, everyone is talking about it, going back to the pre-industrial level of 1.5 degrees, becoming a household name, normalizing net zero, the whole world talking about becoming a world with zero emissions into the atmosphere. Now, clean energy, Kenya, known as the biggest producer of clean energy. Talk about hydropower, talk about solar panels, talk about solar power. Here at Standard Media Group alone, we use solar power to power a lot of the electricals that we use in here. We say that we are champions, we follow. We'd rather lead, others follow now. The noted failures is rising emissions. Despite the agreements from Paris and even COP26, temperatures continue to increase. Temperatures, emissions continue to agree despite years and days sat agreeing and deciding how best they're going to go, but still emissions, temperatures still rising, rising fuel production. We know that that is what powers our cars, powers our industries, and people want to make money. So how else do they do it? By making sure that they just mine more fuel as days go by. Now, the vulnerable suffer. In Kenya, we don't emit a lot, but look at the drought that we continue to face in the country. Talk about Wajir, talk about Wandera, children getting out of school, women looking for water, animals dying every other new day. Now, we talk about COP26. They talked about phasing down of unabated coal power. They didn't talk about phasing it out. They decided to phase it down. Was this what was agreed? Not really. Why not phase it down, not out? And more ambitions on carbon reduction commitments. US and China decided to collaborate on climate change. These are just but the issues that we've been seeing being discussed across the world. But today in COP27, President William Ruto has encouraged the world population to unite in addressing climate effects that have caused wanton destruction in Africa. Speaking at the COP27 meeting in Egypt, Ruto said Africa continues to suffer, insisting that it is time to move beyond talks and start acting now.
must be recalled that Kenya has tremendous hydrocarbon and coal deposits which could go a long way in fueling the engines of our development. Nevertheless, due to resolute commitment, our electricity grid is 93% green. In the face of impending catastrophe, whose warning signs are already unbearably disastrous, weak action is unwise. No action is dangerous. At this point, in the progression of this calamity, we have few choices and little time. Our discourse must focus on delivery, and our conversation must be centered on our commitments and implementation. I call on every delegate here today to rise to the challenge of this moment, to make difficult but necessary decisions and seize transformative opportunity from the grasp of climate disaster.
It is on that level that you also insist that let this not be a PR exercise, but action follows the agreements they agree. This discussion goes over to Purity on the other side. Purity, over to you.
And loss and damage is already happening, and it's trapping people into poverty and threatening their human rights. By 2030, the economic cost in developing countries are expected to reach between 290 and 580 billion US dollars. Yet, 8 years after the creation of the Warsaw International Mechanism on Loss and Damage at COP19, affected families are still getting only but minimal help. At this year's COP27, the developing countries want the developed nations like the US, UK, and those of the EU to pay for the quote-unquote loss and damage they have suffered. They also want help to make the switch rather to cleaner energy and infrastructure. Will they get the money? To help us unpack all this whole issue of financing climate action is Dr. Yvonne Maingi Muriuki, a climate scientist. Welcome and thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me, Purity.
Yes, and it's time to act now. That's what President William Ruto has said while addressing the stakeholders, the climate stakeholders right in Egypt. Would you say, because this conference is coming at a time when developing countries like here in Kenya, we are in the middle of a climate crisis, that's drought. We've seen other countries experiencing floods. Would you say all these disasters are, or does finance have a hand in this?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think I would even go ahead and say we realistically don't have the luxury of just talking anymore. We are in the middle of a climate crisis as it stands. And what does that mean? The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is calling it a code red for humanity as of their report last year. This means that the physical impacts of climate change are so adverse and they disproportionately affect vulnerable communities, particularly here in Africa. Africa is one of the most vulnerable populations when it comes to climate change. What does that mean for us? It means we are a developing economy where we're trying to figure out how to deal with poverty. We're trying to figure out how to deal with water access and gender equality and all of these really big challenges. But what climate change does, it exacerbates this problem. So it makes it harder for us to have to deal with getting clean water and available water. We already are struggling with energy access across the continent. And so these are all issues that are just exacerbated by the climate crisis that we're in right now. But I think it's important that we put it into context that we are in the middle of this. We are struggling with this. We don't have the luxury of talking about it anymore, which is unfortunately the trajectory that has been going on in the global environment, is that we're constantly just talking about it and not focusing on the need. And to your question, you know, is finance the reason why we're in this sort of situation? Yes and no. You know, the climate has changed. We're now at 1.2 degree shift from pre-industrial times. And the current reports are telling us that even the Paris Agreement goal of getting to 1.5 by 2030, we're probably not going to meet that. Actually, it's very highly likely that we will not.
Because the temperatures are rising.
They're rising, and we look at parts of Kenya, for example, Turkana, which is already experiencing a 1.5 degree shift. So we're already there. We're already dealing with these impacts. The climate crisis is already happening. Will finance be key in helping us deal with this situation? Absolutely, because as you know, was just spoken about, Africa accounts for maybe just less than 4% of global greenhouse gas emissions.
Yeah.
So what does that mean? That means that even if the whole of Africa becomes a net zero tomorrow, we're not emitting any carbon or any of the greenhouse gases, we're not going to see any difference in what's happening in the global climate. That's the reality.
And that brings us to the question on loss and damage. I mean, even the Paris Agreement acknowledges the need to have a loss and damage finance, because the developing world is already experiencing the brunt of climate crisis. Why is it difficult or becoming difficult to implement something that governments really committed to do?
Yeah, I mean, loss and damage is just inherently very complicated to think through. One of the reasons is because, you know, when we think about adaptation, or when we think about being more resilient to the impacts of climate change, we can think about it in terms of infrastructure and institutions, and we can very directly measure that impact and how you've made an improvement. Loss and damage caters to things that we can't exactly measure very easily. A good example is look at small island states right now. One of them, you know, the Carteret Islands is a really great example of an island that has literally lost their landmass because of sea level rise. It's so extreme that they've literally lost land. They have to migrate. They have to find new places to live. How do you account for that? How do you pay for that? How do you account for the loss of burial sites, burial grounds? How do you, what cost do you put on that? So that's where it becomes a lot more complex. It's also complex because who has a right to loss and damage?
Yes.
You know, we were experiencing one of the worst droughts in our history.
It's already a fact out there that the developed world, they are the biggest emitters.
Absolutely.
Yes.
They are, absolutely. But we can say who are the biggest polluters. But I cannot tell you that the pollution that the US produced in 1995 is what caused our drought today. You know, and making those connections is very important when it comes to attributing responsibility. But at the end of the day, the reality is the biggest polluters have to pay. There is no debate about it, but they are going to fight it, and that's what they've been doing. They've been fighting because the moment we get into historical pollution, and his historical impact and cost, it becomes a very slippery slope argument, because the kind of claims that can come against these developed countries, they're aware of it, they know it, and they will avoid it at every opportunity to do so.
And you're saying they must pay.
They must
the president just said that countries have to make painful decisions and ensure that, because where we are right now, it's a reality that we're experiencing this. Again, you're saying that what we're even getting, let's even talk about what the developing countries have received and what was promised, and have they even received this amount, how it's supposed to be, or it's a debt kind of
I mean, it's
donation?
it's a good question. It's put into context that our adaptation and resilience needs, and what should help, the finance that will help Kenya implement their nationally determined contribution under Paris, is between 2.8 trillion until the year 2030. That's how much Africa needs to cost this, right? What has been given to date, we're looking at about $30 billion annually, when it's just nowhere near. It's 12% of what we actually need to be getting annually to be able to deal with these impacts. The other thing is that a lot of the funding is very focused on mitigation. So this idea of enhancing our carbon sinks or reducing our emissions, that's where the bulk of the financing is going. Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? That's up for discussion, predominantly because we as a continent are very vulnerable. We need to focus on adaptation.
And at last, of course, during COP27, there is a commitment on loss and damage finance. We'll be talking about that shortly, but let's hear what the global leaders are saying. In Egypt, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has today asked world leaders to work together in addressing climate change, a problem, he says, we can no longer sit and watch as it destroys the world we live in.
And the clock is ticking. We are in the fight of our lives, and we are losing. Greenhouse gas emissions keep growing. Global temperatures keep rising. And our planet is fast approaching tipping points that will make climate chaos irreversible. We are on a highway to climate hell with our foot still on the accelerator. We must, of course, work together to support peace efforts and end the tremendous suffering. But climate change is on a different timeline and a different scale. It is a defining issue of our age. It is the central challenge of our century. It is unacceptable, outrageous, and self-defeating to put it on the back burner.
Let's act now. That's the message by world leaders.
Yeah.
We finally have seen them acting now, and right now we have a loss and damage act. Okay, so what does this mean? Even before we talk about its implementation, what does this mean now to the countries, the developing countries that have been pushing for this act?
I mean, it means that there's definitely an opportunity for them to be able to access money to deal directly with the issues associated with loss and damage as a result of climate change. But I think we also need to deal with the complexities of dispersing climate finance as a whole, and if we don't deal with that, we're still going to be in a very tough position. And one of those is that it's just very difficult to access climate finance. You know, it's so formal, so structured in a way that the people who actually need money on the ground are not able to access that money. We need to deal with that and make sure that informality is being presented in how climate finance is being distributed.
Right.
The other thing that is really key is we need to see how to bring all actors on board. Private sector has a part to play. I saw on the news today Jeff Bezos saying he's not going to pay anything towards, you know, countries that are in need. And if you think about the carbon footprint of a company like Amazon and what they're contributing to the crisis, they have a responsibility to make sure that they're taking care of these countries.
Right.
But they're coming out and saying, you know, we're not going to be involved. So we really need to have a serious conversation around who is going to pay
Yes.
and start to peg, you know, actors such as the Jeff Bezoses of this world to be able to cater for that because they have a need.
And even as they pay, what will it take to implement this? Because do we have, let's even, case in point, Kenya, do we have structures that will ensure that once we get this money, again, there's a way it can trickle down, like you're saying, and help the people that need it?
Absolutely. I mean, it was one of the requirements, even when the GCF was set up, is that, listen, we need to make sure you have the right institutional frameworks for finance to flow. The reality is Kenya has one of the most sort of really clear policy structures on dealing with climate finance, on dealing with climate change. We have a Climate Change Act. Counties themselves have devolved climate change planning. They have climate change funds now that they're actually giving a percentage of their money towards that institutional framework. And our Ministry of Treasury has a policy on climate finance as well. So, I mean, long story short, we have a very clear sort of institutional frameworks that we've set up to deal with this issue.
Right.
At the end of the day, the money still needs to flow.
All right, it will continue to flow, especially if what the world leaders are saying, it's time to act now and make those painful decisions and pay if that has to happen. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
All right, and we shall continue bringing you and unpacking the conversations in Egypt during this COP27. Only the best way that we can, and only on Planet Action. Thank you for watching. I'm Purity Museo. It's now over to you, Aseto.
And as rightfully put, yes, this is the only show that brings you matters climate action, planet action, right here on KTN News. My name is Dennis Aseto. Tomorrow, we talk about conversations surrounding the legalities of climate action and how exactly to fund it. See you tomorrow.